With a gross domestic product of nearly $24 trillion, the United States has by far the largest economy in the world. In fact, the US economy is so large that it accounts for almost a quarter of the world's entire GDP. North Americans devour more products than anyone else, and virtually everyone wants to trade with them. It is by far the most important and lucrative market in the world. No other country comes even close to the economic capacity of this superpower. But how open is Uncle Sam really to world trade? What role does the world trading system play? Are you familiar with the Biden administration's latest bid to integrate the US economy with much of Latin America? Well, in this video, we will answer all these questions, but first we need to know exactly where this whole story began. Let's get started. Humans have been trading for millennia, if not for our entire history. However, the idea of a world made up of international commercial networks and production chains scattered here and there is a much more recent development. On a large scale, it has only been with us for a few decades. For example, the very first free trade agreements between countries dates back to 1860. The instigator was, not surprisingly, the British Empire, with the signing of the Treaty of Cobden Chevalier with France in January of that same year. Decades later, the 1919 Treaty of Versailles was one of the first multilateral documents that considered trade between countries as a key axis for global prosperity. However, the Second World War and the Cold War would cast a shadow on the following decades. For example, in its confrontation with the Soviet Union, the United States promoted free trade, but at the same time, it also maintained many protectionist measures in sectors considered strategic. And at the international level, it focused mainly on security issues. And so, the great explosion of global trade would not come until the 1990s and the beginning of the 21st century. A process that, surprisingly, was not clearly led by the United States. Listen up.
From isolationism to rivalry with Moscow.
It seems there is a broad consensus about the United States. A large part of its enormous success in exploiting its immense economic and political potential was due to its particular geopolitical situation. And you know what? This theory goes way back. Check it out.
The United States finding no enemy abroad who can seriously threaten it, the American people are always engaged in the task of improving their situation. Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, 1835 to 1840. The peculiar security of American geography gave the United States an economic security that enabled it to concentrate on the arts of peace while leaving other nations to indulge their taste for war. David Potter, People of Plenty, Economic Abundance and the American Character, 1954.
The reality is that the US flourished in a climate free of major war conflicts. And yes, I know obviously the Civil War and some relatively minor military friction, such as the Mexican War, eventually made them get their guns out. But obviously, it is nothing in comparison to the constant conflicts that inundated the history of old Europe for centuries. Nor has the United States ever suffered the consequences of having major tyrants at the helm, who were more concerned with filling their pockets than with the country's economic performance and general prosperity. And what can I say? It shows. In any case, the point is that for years and years, Americans grew their economy and developed a huge and thriving domestic market, which, nevertheless, was kept somewhat distant from the rest of the world, until one way or another, the world came to them. This is what is commonly known as American isolationism. But do you want a concrete example of what this political and economic vocation entailed? Well, the United States avoided joining the League of Nations, the forerunner of the UN, at all costs, even though its own president, Woodrow Wilson, had been one of its great promoters. At that time, the United States was not particularly interested in the rest of the world. Don't you remember all that it cost them to jump into World War II? But of course, it was during that conflict that a turning point occurred that would change the history of the world. When Japanese forces bombed Pearl Harbor, it suddenly changed the US perspective forever. From that moment on, the land of the stars and stripes would never look the other way again. But, okay, I know. What on earth does any of this have to do with the subject of this video? Well, you see, the point is that in 1941, in the well-known Atlantic Charter, agreed upon after a secret meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt, these two countries set the following goal:
Clause 4. To extend to all states, small or large, victorious or defeated, the possibility of equal access to world trade and raw materials necessary for their economic prosperity. Letter from the Atlantic, 14th of August, 1941.
And so, when the war ended, and later when the Iron Curtain was lifted, Washington fell into a period of pactomania. That is to say, a kind of almost compulsive obsession to reach new agreements with other countries. We're talking about the time of the Marshall Plan, or the creation of NATO itself.
It's only logical that the United States should do everything in its power to contribute to the return of normal economic health in the world, without which there can be no political stability and no secure peace. Governments, political parties, or groups which seek to perpetuate human misery for the purpose of political or other gain will meet with opposition from the United States. Speech by Secretary of State George Marshall on the 5th of June, 1947.
The priority then was absolutely clear. All the tools of economic cooperation were added to the instruments that the United States could employ in its particular crusade against the Soviet Union. And this was perhaps the only problem. Let's just say the American obsession was focused on reaching agreements that would give them a geopolitical advantage over Moscow and the Soviet threat. In other words, trade was, so to speak, a resource to fight with, not so much an end in itself. But even so, very important progress was made. In 1947, the city of Geneva hosted multiple multilateral meetings where the various powers tried to finalize a new treaty that would give rise to the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. At this summit, the most heated debates were between London and Washington. The old power did not trust in a rapid opening up of markets, while the United States made its unquestionable Western leadership debut, accelerating reforms even further than its own partners expected. Low tariffs, common rules, full mobility of goods, and almost total freedom of exchange. And so you get the idea. If these things are difficult to make happen today, imagine in the 1950s, when there was still a widespread distrust of the newly created bipolar international order. So yes, GATT was passed, but it did not succeed in forcing the Western powers to reduce their tariffs. Rather, this was left to the discretion of the various governments. In addition, shortly after 1948, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Employment took place in Havana, and on 24th of March of the same year, 53 Western states signed a charter seeking the creation of the now well-known International Trade Organization. However, it was right here that the specter of US isolationism reappeared with a vengeance. In 1950, President Truman announced that he would not submit the Havana Charter because, in the Senate, the majority of legislators were opposed to joining this organization. Of course, at the time, if the United States stayed out, it meant that the proposal was automatically cancelled. Thus, the premature dream of having an international trade organization came to an end. The negotiations and promotions of international trade would be carried out in various GATT rounds. The problem is that it was a great deal with many limitations. The treaty had very little power to enforce the rules, was very limited when it came to resolving the various disputes, and only covered the goods market. It did not cover services, intellectual property, or foreign investment. Let's just say that it was a kind of minimum agreement, which, when it came down to it, many countries did not respect. What's more, as more countries joined this agreement, the various negotiations became never-ending. However, as the Cold War began to thaw, the old ideas of integration gathered weight in the United States, and with it, throughout the West. The fall of the Berlin Wall was emblematic, a real turning point.
Fall of the Wall and economic unipolarity.
Between 1947 and 1990, about 8 rounds of negotiations took place within the framework of the GATT agreement. In them, the states' parties met to agree on new measures to facilitate foreign trade. The problem is that these negotiations were very long. On average, each round lasted 29 months. Yeah, that's right. On average, every time they wanted to reduce a trade barrier, they were negotiating for more than 2 years. Nevertheless, progress, what we understand as progress, was made. For example, the round initiated in Switzerland in May 1964, known as the Kennedy Round, represented a major leap forward. Tariffs on many raw materials were reduced by half, and a lot of non-tariff barriers were eliminated. Of course, the following rounds would be quite different, much more bogged down, with more or less constant but often excessively timid progress. This was the case until September 1986, when the 8th round began in Uruguay. This would last no less than 87 months, more than 7 years, in which key events took place: the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. When the round began in Uruguay, Ronald Reagan was in the White House. But after months and months of negotiations in Montevideo, Geneva, Brussels, Washington DC, and Tokyo, the US government changed hands twice. First to Bush Sr. and then to Bill Clinton. In 1993, however, the participating nations finally reached an agreement once and for all. And we're not talking about just any agreement. With the end of the Cold War, a new world had emerged. A world that needed a new system of trade cooperation. And so, VisualPolitik viewers, the idea of a multilateral organization, a body to govern world trade, was successfully revived. Listen up.
Clinton, the WTO, and the integration that wasn't.
April 15th, 1994 was a historic day for the world economy. On that day, 123 countries, including the US, signed the Marrakesh Agreement, which established the World Trade Organization, WTO. And this was, by far, the definitive takeoff of global economic integration, the definitive leap of globalization, and the construction of the world as we know today. As you can see, from that moment on, trade agreements multiplied. Faced with such a scenario, Bill Clinton's presidency went all out with this new organization, achieving some significant milestones, such as the entry of the People's Republic of China into the organization. However, and here is the most curious thing of all, Washington's efforts were particularly focused on the rest of the world. That is to say, within the White House itself, there was still no landslide of new free trade agreements that it was planning to sign with a world that was abandoning socialism at full speed in order to throw itself into the arms of trade, capitalism, and globalization. At that time, the only relevant free trade agreement that the United States had was a 1988 agreement with Canada, an agreement that Clinton would convert in 1994 to include Mexico in the North American Free Trade Agreement, the well-known NAFTA. This was the first major step taken by the United States to join the new wave of free trade that was sweeping the world.
I'd also like to welcome here the representatives from Mexico and Canada and tell them they are, in fact, welcome here. They are our partners in the future that we are trying to make together.
Of course, it would take time for US enthusiasm to bear fruit. It was not until 2004 that the United States signed new free trade agreements with Chile, Australia, Jordan, Singapore, the Dominican Republic, and Central America. The president of the time, George W. Bush, was a strong supporter of extending and expanding this policy. However, in 2005, there was a terribly painful door slamming that would leave many scars in the White House. What are we talking about? Well, listen closely.
A superpower rejected by its neighbors.
In November 2003, 34 countries, practically the entire American continent as a whole, met in Miami to discuss a plan devised by the White House, an unprecedented plan that sought to extend the North American Free Trade Agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States to the entire region, thus creating what is known as the Free Trade Area of the Americas, FTAA. The agreement was to be concluded within 2 years, but by 2005, at the 4th Summit of the Americas held in Argentina, George W. Bush came face to face with the red wave that was sweeping the region at the time, just as it is today, and it almost doesn't matter what year you watch this video.
Aquí en Mar del Plata está la tumba del Alca. Alca, Alca, al carajo.
Nuestros pobres, nuestros excluidos, nuestros países, nuestra democracia ya no soportan más que sigamos hablando en voz baja. Es fundamental hablar con mucho respeto y en voz alta para construir un sistema que nos vuelva a contener a todos en un marco de igualdad y nos vuelva a devolver la esperanza y la posibilidad de construir, obviamente, un mundo distinto.
The FTAA was not a demand from Latin America. It was an offer from Washington that, incredibly, was rejected, which was one of the most humiliating days for the US foreign policy in recent decades. The idea, the plan, the great gamble of the Oval Office had been publicly and notoriously mistreated by the great socialist leaders of that time. At the end of that summit, Bush left Argentina, ending the integration adventure. Ironically, this time it was the world, in this case Latin America, that was saying no to the US, which naturally meant rejecting a golden opportunity to integrate Latin America with the largest economy on the planet. Seeing is believing.
Why you wouldn't want to have access to US markets? Trade agreements reduce barriers and tariffs. That's what they do. That's why you have a trade agreement. They don't make it harder to access markets, they make it easier to access markets. And why wouldn't people want to access our vast market? I don't know.
It was a failed gamble, which was yet another turning point for the United States. Listen up.
Post-FTAA, everything much more measured.
The United States had begun to open up trade with its closest neighbors, Mexico and Canada. It then wanted to take this gamble to the entire American continent. But the slamming of the door on the FTAA soon made Washington tired of it. Currently, these are the only 19 US free trade agreements in force. And that is not all. If, in addition to the free trade agreements, we consider other lesser agreements, we can see how the openness of the North American giant is much more limited. But how on earth is it possible that countries such as Peru, Turkey, China, or even Ukraine have signed more trade agreements than the United States? Is the United States really such a closed country? Well, the truth is that there are several nuances to be noted here, starting with this. The United States continues to conduct most of its trade under the Most Favored Nation Clause, a WTO clause that guarantees that the best treatment that one member country gives to another member has to apply to all, except in cases of free trade agreements. In this way, the United States sets its tariffs, then applies them across the board. This results in, for example, 49.9% of all US imports entering tariff-free in 2021. Around 14.8% of imports benefited from tariff reductions, and 0.9% benefited from unilateral preferences in favor of poorer countries. In other words, it is not that the United States has closed itself off from the world or renounced the benefits of trade, but rather that it has used WTO rules on tariffs to the hilt. For example, negotiating and setting the level of tariffs for each type of product. This has given Washington much more political control over trade management, and that is what explains news items like this.
The million-dollar crisis of the Spanish black olive due to the US tariff. The EU and the US diffused their tariff war on steel and aluminium.
It must be said, however, that the United States generally applies a customs tariff that is among the lowest in the world. We're talking about an average of 3.5%. Nevertheless, in recent years, the United States has been working on the possible creation of a US Middle East Free Trade Zone, a Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and a utopian transatlantic trade and investment partnership with the European Union. However, the arrival of Trump in the White House meant that all of these efforts by the Obama administration fell by the wayside. Of course, now that position could change again, and what's more, it could do so in Latin America. Have you heard about the Biden administration's latest bet on trade? Are we facing a new gringo landing in Latin America? Well, stay tuned.
Alliance for Economic Prosperity in the Americas, FTAA 2.0.
In June 2022, the creation of the Alliance for Economic Prosperity in the Americas was announced, an initiative whose member countries are Barbados, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Mexico, Panama, Peru, Uruguay, and which is beginning to look like a more moderate FTAA, but aimed at building a new close alliance with a strong commercial commitment sooner or later. All among close friends, of course.
This dialogue brings together the strength, ingenuity, and diversity of an incredibly dynamic region. We are 90% of the GDP of the Western Hemisphere, almost 2/3 of its population. There is nothing we can't do together. Anthony J. Blinken, US Secretary of State.
Few details are known yet, but for the moment, the White House has made it clear that this initiative is designed to boost trade, investment, and the application of common regulations among the countries that are part of this new initiative. Among other things, it is one of the formulas with which the Biden administration aims to reduce China's influence. How? By promoting regional production chains, the nearshoring that we have already mentioned here on VisualPolitik.
The Americas Partnership will accelerate our shared work to strengthen supply chains and to make them more resilient to future shocks so that the goods and products that our populations rely on are affordable and available, and workers' rights are respected in the doing.
In any case, if one thing is clear, it could be a golden opportunity, one more, for Latin America to take a huge leap forward once and for all. How? Well, if its leaders are smart enough to take advantage of the largest consumer and investment market on the planet. In any case, I think you'll agree that it is somewhat amusing that the United States, the great capitalist power that won the Cold War, has failed to lead the world trade system. But having reached this point, it's your turn. Do you think the US should be much more ambitious with its trade policy? Would this be a good thing or a bad thing? What role will the Alliance for Economic Prosperity in the Americas come to play? Leave us your thoughts in the comments and let's open up a debate. If you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. All the best, see you next time.